Pedro. I'm the PR manager here at Ravinia. We're excited to have Historic Ravinia in a partnership with the Historical Society of Highland Park to have a presentation today. We'll be talking about early Ravinia history with Art Miller. Art Miller is a PhD from Northwestern in English. He retired as the Architecture and Special Collections Library at Lake Forest, and he lives in Lake Forest, and he's the co-author of about 6 to 7 books specifically talking about what we're talking about today, history and architecture and things of the sort. So, we're really honored to have him here to have a presentation today. So I'd like to bring up Art Miller to the stage, and he will give you a wonderful presentation about the history of Ravinia. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate it very much. It's delightful to be in this wonderful space, and I'm going to try to talk about the relationship of the neighborhood and the park in its period up to about 1931. I'm going to talk first about the origins of the community and the park, then talk some about the period when, after they had a little hiccup in the arrangements and became an opera site. And then the last part of it will be more about the architecture, specifically of the park, challenging some of the assumptions about the architecture maybe, and trying to help read it a little bit to help you see how it fits together and makes sense in Chicago. So without saying more, here we go. Let's see if I can make this work. So first off, I have to say that if people who know Ravinia well may all have this book, but if you don't, you should. It's a 1988 book by Michael Ebner, University of Chicago Press. I'm sure it's still in print. And it's really a very good survey of the general aspects of the history. And Michael Ebner just happens to be a colleague of mine at Lake Forest College. He's also emeritus, like myself, retired. But his book is very helpful, and it also suggested to me, maybe not right in the Ravinia section, but it suggested to me something about the way that the rhythm of the North Shore goes along the lakefront, that he sort of said that there were sort of communities that had strong, positive identities, and that in between some of those strong positive identities there were interesting creative areas. So let me compare Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, for instance, to Highland Park and Ravinia. And Lake Forest and Lake Bluff are still separate communities. Highland Park annexed Ravinia in 1899 to be part of the larger city. And so the identities of the major community and the smaller community have still continued, but the relationship is different. For instance, our historical society in Lake Forest is referred to as its formal name is the Lake Forest Lake Bluff Historical Society, covering both. So it makes for interesting, I'll try to work on some of the contrast here. So first, I'll just show this little picture. It's an etching or an engraving, I guess, by Ralph Fletcher Seymour, showing the view at Ravinia. He lived here pretty early, coming in the 1890s. He was an artist and printer and publisher in Chicago, a very arts and crafts sort of person, and was here pretty early, living on the edge of the ravines. Now here's a map that gives you a little bit of an idea about the south part of Highland Park, and the corner, the lower left corner, has the Braeside area, and then the Ravinia area up north, farther up, developed. This is a 1902 map, but the town had been settled, the Ravinia around Roger Williams had been settled by a Baptist community in about 1874, and this is almost the same time that Lake Bluff was developed as a Methodist summer camp community, which I was sort of interested to see the differences, and Lake Forest is Presbyterian. So these different religious groups were part of the organizing of a lot of the North Shore. The Baptist community is remembered in the streets. Roger Williams was the founder of the American Baptist movement. There's the Judson Street and others that are named after prominent Baptists that aren't on the tip of my tongue. But that's an interesting, important part of the heritage. Now, by 1902, something that was already along was a trolley line that went parallel to the Northwestern tracks that had gone through in 1855. It started out as a little humble Waukegan trolley system in town, but a fellow named A.C. Frost developed it to go by 1899, all the way from Waukegan down to Evanston. So, and later went further up to Milwaukee, as we know. But, and stopped operating on this line, this east line, in 1955. But this shows some of the original kind of streetcars that they had in the 1890s. So here's just a little bit closer showing where that lower part, this sort of a little bit of a no man's land. We also know about the sort of no man's land in Wilmette, and that was not, this isn't quite as colorful as that had a history of being. It was a little more staid, but it did have a variety, and we're going to see some of that. Now, I mentioned Seymour, and this is a portrait of him. But he was very much influential. His books were not printed in huge volume, but they were influential. For instance, there's one that he called The Art of the People, a William Morris talk that he, in 1902, reprinted. And he gave a copy of this to Gaylord Donnelly of the our Donnelly Printing. He was the second generation of the printing company in Chicago. The next year after this, and the point of this article was that craftsmanship was essential, and it wasn't exactly the outcome that I think Seymour would have expected to get from R. Donnelly. He thought probably he would get a nice commission from him. Instead, Donnelly said, harumph, you can't just do good work with machines and with handwork. Machines can do good work. So he started his Lakeside Classics series, which was a giveaway to employees and customers and friends in 1903, and it's still going every year. A volume of that comes out. And it was just a very finely crafted, in-house produced small book that was, and so Seymour got a little different than he expected to get from it, but he influenced something that's been a major Chicago cultural fact for over 100 years. Now, this gives you kind of an overview by 1902, 1904, 1906, this is a 1906 print, of how the Ravinia area sort of spread out over this part of it. It's a view of Ravinia from Ravinia Festival, or Ravinia Park at that time. It was an amusement park. It was built by the railroad. A.C. Frost actually had originally a German name. He was a German. And anglicized his name, which probably helped a lot in Chicago after the Haymarket riots. But he was a very good entrepreneur and started this railroad, and then had this central electric plant that had to be, was always cranking, and he had to use that electricity. So he started the amusement park to get people coming along and going and stopping and spending the day there and using electricity. There was another place called the Fort Sheridan Park, which nobody here would have gone to that one because it served alcohol. This one was properly dry. Now, this shows that the Green Bay Road was somewhat rural at that time. You can see here, it doesn't look too, or one of the streets here, I can't tell which one that is. This might be along the east side. But whatever it was pretty rural in that period. The roads looked very countrified. And so if you weren't on the railroad, you were kind of out there. So, what did these buildings look like at that time? First, there was the theater, the building that we're in today, and it did a wide variety of things going on there originally. For instance, here's a person who summered in Lake Forest. John T. McCutcheon did a cover for a play in 1906, kind of a nice cover, and he was active here too, so that shows that Lake Forest had an interest, and already pretty soon they were running special railroads down here too from Lake Forest. Here we have a view of another play by Northwestern's theater department in 1909. Now, the Chicago Literary Renaissance is supposed to start around 1912, when the Poetry Magazine was started, the Little Theater in Chicago was started, a few other institutions. Actually, what we could say is that this was going on already here. There were school-based groups, like Forrest had a group from 1903. I'm not sure when this group got started, but around the same time, maybe a little after. And there was culture going on in these communities, and it simply was recognized as a particular literary renaissance a little bit later. But it was part of a larger American renaissance, I think we could say. And they also showed movies. By 1907, Joseph Medill Patterson, who was in the city and was part of the Tribune team, part of their family, wrote the first piece of film criticism about the Nickelodeons of the day. But movies were big already by the period of this theater soon after its opening. Now, then there were all kinds of other activities. There was Walter Damrush brought his New York Symphony here for a 5-week play. This is the birth of the summer festivals in this period. They tried it here. Then there was the Chicago Symphony under Frederick Stock. I guess they called it the Thomas Orchestra at that time under Frederick Stock. Now, they also had private solo performances, and there's a piano right back here. And this is a pianist. And I use just this example of many pictures that could be picked from the period, only because I can't imagine how she saw the keyboard. Challenging. Okay, there was outside of this building, there was also a wonderful restaurant and ballroom above it, a casino, they called it. Not the same way that they mean that this was not run by native peoples, but was just a place for non-alcoholic enjoyment. But it's an interesting building, and it was pretty big. Came down, I think, in 1986, finally. This is a closer view of it with some of the landscaping of the period. This shows a picture of the pavilion that preceded the pavilion that maybe some people here might remember it, but there was a wooden pavilion there until 1949, but this is what it looked like. And there was also a baseball stadium, something many people are interested in today. But notice the very clean modern lines of that thing. Here's another view of it. And so the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railroad was pretty well developed and had a stop here, at least on the weekends and things, in that period, which is pretty interesting. And so people by then were arriving also by car. Cars that hit in Lake Forest, I know by 1904, everybody had to have one, sort of like they have to have a Tesla or an iPhone 6S Plus or whatever. Early adopters, we'll call them, but early adopters could come in their own cars. But more people came by the train, and here's the train that was servicing people. Now, the amusement park, as you can see, had a toboggan, and there was one like that in Lake Forest over Sheridan Road, actually, from the Winter Club to the people across the street on the east. But this period kind of came to a halt. They had something that fortunately never happens anymore. They had economic ups and downs. There was a panic in 1907. Thank goodness we have no more panics in the market. How bad it would be if we did. But they struggled a little bit after that. The company, A.C. Frost Company, had difficulty and finally succumbed by 1911 and went bankrupt. But it was picked up by a donor. Good for the tradition of Ravinia, Louis Eckstein. Basically, he transformed it into an opera venue and took care of it through the period of until 1931, almost until he died. But he was really the major backer for this, and it was a Chicago businessman, had lots of interests in retail and various things, and owned and started drugstore chains, which was interesting. And by 1944, his wife Elsie on the left had actually donated the place to an organization to keep it going separately. But Ravinia Opera was the star of this period. It was quite a stellar kind of attraction for everyone, and grand opera, not just opera, but Ravinia Grand Opera. And I only have one opera picture to show you here of a person, but here it shows that they got into the whole costume thing then. Here's an Italian dell'arte kind of costume. And in the 1925 program, for the year, it had this wonderful view of people and the glamour of the people who were visiting the pavilion. And if you, with slightly different lines, it doesn't look that different today, really, when we visit there. So this is kind of going on at the same time that other things are going on in Highland Park. We said that 1911 it became the Opera Place. Now we're getting into that Chicago Literary Renaissance period. I'm going to call it the American Renaissance in that time. And the Lakeshore Country Club, just south of the county line in Glencoe, went from the railroad tracks all the way to the lake. And this substantial clubhouse, even by today's standards, is a big clubhouse, was built for the Lakeshore Country Club, which was, many members were members of the Standard Club. Members were Jewish. It's interesting, they had an architect, Howard Van Doren Shaw, who was a Lake Forester, who did a lot of buildings. He did Market Square in 1916, but he did the first plan for that in 1912, around the time that this club was being done. But on his staff, from somewhere around 1909, 1910, we're not exactly sure when he started it, even when he exactly ended, but we know he was done being on Howard Shaw's staff. David Adler ended there in December 31st of 1912. So this would have been when he was involved with it. His uncle Stonehill owned the property to the south of the club, and it's now the synagogue, but it was a fabulous showplace for David Adler's uncle, done by him, claimed by him, and also claimed by Shaw, because it was done while he was on Shaw's staff. And so I think David Adler had a great design sense and learned some things about how to make a house work from working with Shaw, who did lots of country houses all over the country, more in number than Adler, although Adler's are more probably standouts and better known nationally. He's considered to be the leading, David Adler was considered to be the leading architect recently when there was this, they brought somebody from out east to look at things for a show at the Art Institute in 2002, 2003, and he pretty much said that Adler stood out above anybody else nationally for his type of architecture, classic, traditional in that period. So the club was one thing. Another thing that was very important for the Ravinia neighborhood was a very important, very probably brilliant Julius Rosenwald, who was president of Sears Roebuck, helped it through some of its early transitions into a huge major firm with stores. He lived in Hyde Park originally, and I'm showing this mostly because I lived here as a graduate student. This is at 4901 Ellis. It was a graduate student residence at that time. Fabulous place, and the place is now condominiums, but he had this very substantial house across from Gustavus Swift, for instance. It was done by Fellows and Nimmons, I think, with the architects in 1903. And shortly after that, he had a garden done there. Now, when I lived there, this garden was long gone. But he had a fabulous garden done with all kinds of natural materials, and we know who did that, I think. It would be Jens Jensen, an important resident of Ravinia for many years, started his summer place here at the clearing in 1908, in this early part of the period, and worked on it for several years till about 1915 it was done, and made it his full-time residence year-round by 1918. But so it's all through this period. But it started out as his summer place, and here he is with Mrs. Jensen. I think Jensen was born originally was born in 1860. He lived until 1951. His wife died in 1935. She was contemporary. And this is a picture of them in their dooryard. Here's a picture of the meadow there, which this could be any of Jensen's meadows. He had lots of these. Unfortunately, sometimes they were referred to as vacant lots in Lake Forest, which means that they don't survive, and probably all along the North Shore, Glencoe, Highland Park. But he was certainly famous for these kind of meadows, and he didn't always have a drawing done, so they're not even always known. They look like they're just natural woods with natural forests on the edges, but you'll see that there's on the left there's kind of a hawthorn tree. He would try to step down from tall trees to smaller trees into the lawn, and that was fairly typical of him. And that was a very characteristic feature of many places in both Highland Park, Ravinia, and Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. I think in Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, he did about at least 40 known jobs, and I know of some unknown jobs too. Another part of it was all the sort of arts, doing your own entertainment. One of the reactions against the movies in this period was that there were people who thought that that was too mechanical, and they wanted to do, so it was a real rebirth of doing things yourself. Here they're doing folk dances at the clearing. So that was an important part of it. Now, Jensen retired in 1935 after his wife passed away and moved to Ellison Bay, Wisconsin. His practice and his home here was taken over by his son-in-law and his assistant from 1915 on, landscape architect Marshall Johnson. Now, Marshall Johnson is shown here with one of his Lake Forest clients. He's on the right, and the Lake Forest client, Mrs. Peabody, had an open day at her gardens with her gardener here. She had a very nice 4-acre garden in Lake Forest that he did in about the late 20s, Marshall Johnson. He lived in Highland Park until 1967, picked up a lot of the clients from Jensen, including the Ford Motor Company, and Jensen had refused to do a formal rose garden for Mrs. Edsel Ford, and Johnson said, "I'll do you a rose garden," and so she was very happy. He also did World's Fair, 1939 World's Fair for the Ford Company, and it was a major client, and he actually built a house in Ravinia based on his Ford gig through the 30s. Another person who lived in the neighborhood that many of you will know is May, if I say this right, Thielgard Watts, May Watts, we'll call her. And she was an ecologist. It was a direct laying on of hands with Henry Coles, who brought ecology from Germany to America formally as a scholar in 1899 with his dissertation on the Indiana dunes. She was one of his students and was very active in Highland Park in many ways. But her best book, and anybody in Ravinia, I said they should all have Michael Ebner's book. If you can get your hands on this book, if you don't have it already, Reading the Landscape is fabulous. And on her cover, she actually has a ravine. And it shows, and the point that she makes is that if you're on if you're on the south side of the ravine, you're in trouble because the sun would never hit it. So you get mostly sad little boreal plants from way further up north by Canada. If you have the north side of the ravine, you have a great garden. And so she showed how the sunlight would hit the north side of the ravine, not the south side of the ravine. Simple, but a fact. So another ecologist that's not as well known, but also who lived in Ravinia in the 1930s was Elizabeth Teeter Smith Lunn, L-U-N-N. She's the person sitting in the front row on the left. She was chairman of the biology department in the 1950s, as this picture shows. And if I'm wrong, Professor Schultz in the back will yell out that no, she wasn't then. But I'm pretty sure that's right. He was there then too. And these are honor students in the department. But she did a book. It was really a work for almost her whole career of working on the Indiana dunes. The Illinois dunes, Dunesland, up north by Winthrop Harbor, up north of Waukegan. It's a flat area, but with ridges going back and sort of like swales of sandbars. And so it was a life's work, and it came out in 1987. And it's another good book to have, and it is for someone who lived here in Ravinia, by someone who lived here in Ravinia as part of her career. So now this picture is of a Highland Park beach, and what's interesting to show about it is how wide the beach is. In 1900, they opened the drainage canal so that they would have the water going out of the lake down into carrying sewage out south toward the Illinois River and the Mississippi system to naturally clean itself. It's coincidental, at least, that starting then the lake level went down, and it didn't go up until about 1930. And so in Lake Forest, there were formal gardens planned down below. There was a swimming pool at Villa Turcum, which is just north of Fort Sheridan. And also at Villa Turcum, Harold McCormick landed his little private plane there on the beach. So it shows you how substantial it was. And I'm only mentioning all this because at Ravinia's beach, or south, let's say Braeside, depending on what you consider to be Ravinia, but little south in the kind of no man's land, over by the beach, every night was walking Margaret Anderson. She was the editor of the Little Review. And I'm going to show kind of a range of kinds of people who lived in Ravinia in that period. Margaret Anderson was, I think we could safely say today, in a way that's not threatening really, but she was a cultural revolutionary. That's different than a political revolutionary, but she was a cultural revolutionary. Her Little Review, it basically said, making no compromise with the public taste. That was her motto. So you can imagine that had trouble along the way, immediately with the post office at one point when they published the first issue of part of the first section of Ulysses by James Joyce. And so she had a hard time. She was definitely challenging the liberal ideals of people in this Chicago literary Renaissance period. She had lots of friends come and visit her. Some of them became major authors later. One is Sherwood Anderson, visited out there on the beach. They had 5 tents. And it was quite a setup, like a little compound that was on the beach. They had no authority to be there, and nobody really tried to hassle her out of the way, but she spent an entire summer there, I think about 1916 probably. And so Sherwood Anderson was one of her more tame visitors. Another visitor was, and this is a younger picture of her, Emma Goldman, who considered herself an anarchist. This was quite a way off the spectrum from Bernie Sanders, I think. Quite a ways. I mean, there's quite a ways from democratic socialist to anarchist. And so she was not always considered to be suitable by some of the more conservative parts of the community. But that just shows you how Ravinia was hosted lots of interesting, different people in those periods. And Margaret Anderson's partner in the magazine and in life was Jane Heap, who lived with her, and so she was very forward about how she wanted to live and what she thought about culture. Now the opposite position was taken by a fellow named Clifford Raymond. Clifford Raymond lived down here also. I found this out from the late Arthur Dubin. I learned about Clifford Raymond. He was an editorial writer for the Chicago Tribune. Very important. And I'll show you here. This is a map of I think the executive floor in the Tribune Tower. I suppose you can now buy this as an apartment if you want to. But it was a fabulous suite. And on the lower part of the picture on the left is Captain Patterson. This is after World War I, 1925. Captain Patterson of the company. And on the right was Colonel McCormick. Patterson moved to New York. McCormick stayed here. And just up above McCormick, 1, 2, 3, the third office up is Mr. Raymond. So he was writing those editorials, sitting right there near the boss in 1925, writing the editorials. And I'm sure that they would have been appropriate for him. But what's interesting and why he's at the opposite end, not just that Colonel McCormick wasn't conservative, probably nobody here is old enough to remember, but he was fairly conservative. He had gone in 1937 to Mexico to cover the hearings or the trial of Trotsky in Mexico, and came back in the transcript that Arthur Dubin owned from Mr. Raymond is now at the college's, Lake Forest College archives. But his typed transcript of that trial solidified his position certainly against Stalin in the late 30s, and I think had an effect on the conservative position of the Tribune and America First, which was active from 40 to 41. Now, Also, in 1921, he worked with John T. McCutcheon and published a book called Clifford and John's Almanac. Clifford wrote the text, and John did the pictures. And I think a couple of these pictures might be portraits of Raymond. Here's one of him looking out a window. And here's a winter scene. He actually had Raymond moved into the house that I think a pioneer settler had here in town. Levi Kunstock's home. And so you can see it's fairly primitive. And this is by 1920s, we were also already in the looking back toward the colonial era, early Americana. And so here's this ideal picture of a kind of one living room place, and here's the fellow this is the picture for December, and it shows the fellow in front of his fire. And this could have picture, except for what he's wearing, could have taken place 200 years earlier somewhere. But this was in Ravinia, which was still pretty wild. So that's kind of the neighborhood, the context. Now let me show you a little bit about the park and more about the buildings. As you can see the layout here, on the left is the ballpark, and there was the stadium that we saw earlier. Then south of, and that was north. Then in the middle is the theater we're in right now, the Martin Theater. And then south of that there was a carousel, but then beyond that was the casino, and then south of that again, there was a little bit of a fountain over there. Now across the tracks there was a hotel also, which is interesting. This picture is from 1931, and that was the period when, this photograph is from 1931, and that's when the period, shall we say, they went into hiatus here at the park. That's when they could no longer function, and even Mr. Eckstein couldn't keep it going then. So let's look again at these buildings. Here's our theater building we know, the casino, the pavilion, and the stadium or grandstand, all designed by Peter Weber. Peter J. Weber was born in Germany, studied over there, came to the United States by way of Brazil, or Argentina, I'm sorry. In Argentina, a project failed down there. He came up just in time for the Chicago's 1893 World's Fair and helped work on that. He was very current with everything going on in the German period. Remember I said that the owner of the railroad was really a German who'd anglicized his name. And so he was very up on this. Is a Viennese train station from just around the turn of the century, pretty modern looking. And he'd worked with Atwood, and then under Burnham, had worked with Atwood on the Palace of Fine Arts at the 1893 World's Fair. Very crisp, clean classicism, very forward-looking classicism. And so he then worked with Burnham, did some skyscrapers in Chicago also, but in 1904 had this very nice project job to work on, this really campus of recreational buildings. So here's a picture showing the relationship of the railroad to a gate that I don't think is there now, and the casino, which isn't there. This would be kind of roughly where the other performing place is here, the Stearns Theater. And here's another view showing the garden setting. But notice the two towers, the dome on the top of the one. There's one window in the front of the hexagonal of each hexagonal tower, and then there's a kind of an entry part there. The literature says, and the fellow named Jeffries, who wrote the article about Peter Weber, said that it was all based on Spanish architecture, Spanish mission-style architecture, and that's true. And here's an example. You notice the roof is like that. It's got the two wings of it, like in the casino. But there are other precedents that are maybe almost as compelling. For instance, here's two towers, hexagonal with one window like that, and a kind of rounded entry or a segmental arch entry. This is a 1500s Elizabethan gatehouse from England. So it was sort of standard late medieval, early Renaissance Renaissance architecture, which is also what many of the missions were. And here's another one that's similar with this very simple, crisp architecture, but notice the little roofs on the towers, very interesting. So it's possible to see a lot of late medieval, early Renaissance roots for what he was doing with his American Renaissance collection of buildings, Peter Weber. Now here's a fellow traveler of his was Irving W. Pond, who did this building that burned in 1946 in Lake Forest. It was Reed Hall of Lake Forest Academy. The land is now Lake Forest College's South Campus, but this was a fabulous building. Notice the little tower there that you see, and the sort of flat surfaces, the very almost aesthetic movement flat surfaces. This is Irving W. Pond. They were part of the Chicago school, but they were not Prairie really. They marched to their own drummer. There's another house that they did in Lake Forest that's pretty stunning because it used it actually was very much influenced by the secessionist movement in Vienna in the early 1900s. Here's Seymour's print again this is Seymour's print of the pavilion, people going in there in Ravinia. And here's the pavilion again, one more time. Here's what it looks like on the interior. And it was of wood, but it wasn't that different in character from what still is there today. It was truthful to it. But I think its roots are in a different kind of a tradition. I think it's the bungalow tradition. This is a Florida bungalow from the period, and there's a lot of open space, as you can see, very open feeling. And the bungalows originated in India, and the air would flow through, and I think it was another influence that was very active at that time that he picked up on. Now, those posts that we saw back in that interior view, look at those posts, and then look at these posts in the surviving Ravinia gate. It's very similar. So in other words, he repeated that form over there on that wooden pavilion. So the gate is not only just a very useful and charming feature, but it also is a kind of a key to reading what the original park would have been like. The grandstand, now that's very crisp looking. Very crisp looking architecture, simple, utilitarian, but also well proportioned. And look at how this is a photograph of the same thing. And then here's another photograph that shows how that very plain surface was there. This is the building that has the two levels, kind of a Monterey Spanish colonial place. And here's a place that we might know better, the Cheney Mansion in Chicago, that has similar relationships as to the grandstand space. See? So this is by Louis Sullivan, and his, at that time, was still working for him, but also working for himself, which led to a little dust up, Frank Lloyd Wright. And so those two people influenced that building. And this building would have been, I think, the sort of thing that, this was from 10 years earlier, and would have been known by Peter Weber. Now this building is end of the 1890s in Vienna, and this was the main hall for the secessionist movement. Notice how crisp that is, how it's unadorned, the unadorned character of it. Similar again to this modern structure. So if we now look at the Murray Theater building, Murray Martin Theater, notice the back, the stage thing is very plain, kind of like the stadium was, and sort of like that thing of only maybe 5 years earlier, that secessionist building in Vienna. So here's the building we know it as we know it today. This is Martin Theater. This is how it looked after the mid-90s renovations. But notice the roof pitch here. See how it's kind of this is a mission, and there's a roof pitch very similar to that with the Murray. Then there's this wonderful, these lanterns outside, which are just, they're stunning. They're on their own. They stand alone as just great, I guess you'd say Chicago school architecture. And it could be used other places. This is a classic feature in the music room at a place over in Lake Forest that was started in just about the same time as this was being built. Melody Farm for J. Ogden Armour. He was the second richest American after Rockefeller in that period before World War I. And had similar kind of features. That was done by Arthur Hoyne, who was a prominent society architect of the day. Now back to the Martin Theater. This is on the north side. There's this window, but it shows the windows that we know well over there, this over in a corner. And here's the south side, and you see it looks almost like, from a distance in a garden setting like that, it almost looks like trellises or trelliage. That's the exterior, what it feels like. It feels very garden-esque. Now, here's looking at it from inside. And what's interesting about these stained glass windows, as to ones we mostly use, there's no story here, there's no... so what's going on here? Look at all the repetition. Where does that repetition come from? Maybe some of you know this ceiling in town. This is the Chicago Stock Exchange, 1895, by Louis Sullivan. And this was the ceiling, the lights for the ceiling. This has been preserved, reconstructed, rehabilitated by John Vinci for the Art Institute edition in 1976. He saved it. It was torn down in 1972-3, but he saved it, and they replicated what was missing or lost. This picture shows a little bit more how the ceiling works. Even though it's black and white, it shows how the ceiling worked. It had there was a definite pattern to it, and it interacted with stenciling we can see along there. So here he is again. There's Sullivan, and there's John Vinci. Now, John Vinci also was a major. He felt very badly about, when he saved that room, he felt badly about Richard Nicol, who died he was a preservation photographer who died in the collapse of the Chicago Stock Exchange. They found him the next day or something like that, really terrible. And so Vinci was his friend, one of the best preservation architects in Chicago, and he has worked for years, decades, 4 decades or so, to get all of his, photography published. It was published in a book in 2010, The Complete Architecture of Adler and Sullivan. That was Dankmar, Adler, and Sullivan. I was happy. I got it for Christmas. I was happy to see this week on the internet that my copy is now worth $800. So you never know. Now, here's our ceiling. We can look up. You don't have to look at my slide. But the ceiling is quite distinctive. This is something that came from Paris, not Germany, but Paris. Viollet-le-Duc, who was directing the schools of architecture in the mid-19th century, encouraged people to be honest about structure and to share structure the way it looked. And so this is a good example of that happening. And the lighting is certainly of the period, sort of Tiffany-esque lighting. Now, where are the sources for this? One place that I don't have a good slide of is the 1892 Durand Institute at Lake Forest College. The Art Institute has the same kind of structure showing it's in there. But here's a wooden version from the early 1890s in a mission church. You can see the structure up above there, and that was by Irving W. Pond. Now, another thing about the ceiling, while we're up there, is to look at the stenciling. The stenciling is, and there's a close-up of it, it's, again, something that was really being fostered, encouraged by Sullivan. And this is the color isn't right, but this is a picture of some of the stenciling, some of the elaborate stenciling, where they would do layer after layer after layer of different colors of stenciling all over that big stock exchange room. And so this was at least paying homage to that idea of using a stencil. The repetition, if you see all around this building, it's repetition in the glass windows in the back of the room, the repetition there of the squares with diagonal lines through them. So there was a very clear sense of that Chicago school element here. Stephen, there's our man again, Sullivan. So back we are to the what the park looked like originally in 1931. It then started up again in and this is going to be a later talk. I'm only going up to 1931 really here, but this was really quite an accomplishment. A big campus by Peter Weber. He did other buildings, but I think this ensemble was really quite interesting, and as interesting as anything. And we can celebrate his accomplishment here, I think, beautifully preserved. It was preserved in the 1990s. there was Skidmore, Owings and Merrill did the renovation from the Murray Theater. It had been air conditioned in 1963. There's a sign in the back that actually gets all this straight. So don't count on what I'm saying, read the sign too. But 1963 it was air conditioned. And so then that was named the Murray Theater at that time. It had been the Ravinia Theater, then the Murray Theater, and then it became the Martin Theater a year after the completion of this wonderful really restoration of one of the great spaces in Chicago. And everyone who lives in Ravinia has one of Chicago's great spaces in their neighborhood. So thank you very much for your patience, and I think we'll have time for some rebuttals, and okay, good. So if someone would like to ask a question or rebut what I've said, that would be great. Pedro's got the, here we come.
Hi,
Yes.
I was really admiring the beautiful stenciling here.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that the Chicago-esque style? or-
Well, I mean, Sullivan was really, really one of the main proponents of doing that, yes. And his were very elaborate, and this is not as elaborate, but it shows that there was a real support for that still in 1904. It was a very strong visual element that people would have thought that was current.
It's
That was
beautiful.
It is, it's remarkable. In a beautiful shape here, we can see it all. Surely we have a rebuttal.
Quickie. In the beginning of your presentation, you referred to a book by Michael Ebner and said that we should try to get a copy, but you never mentioned the title.
Oh.
So, ¿qué pregunta?
Okay, it's Creating Chicago's North Shore, a Suburban History. Creating Chicago's North Shore. I've got about 20 copies of some sources, listings of pieces of paper here, and Mr. McTeer has one of these down here too, and he could hand some out to people that want to see some of the sources that I credit. I mentioned most of them going along, the article, the book of all the Sullivan works. Lots of people were helpful on this. Nancy Webster, who is now in the Highland Park Library with the archives from the Historical Society, was very helpful. Works from there were very helpful for this. So sources like that are listed.
How about the organ pipes to either side?
Yes. Now, I don't know so much about the organ, but it looks like one of the period. Lake Forest College had one about the same period. I don't think it's been active since the early days. I mean, maybe the first, up through the first amusement park period. I'm not sure it made it into the opera period, but I could be wrong. I could be corrected on that. It looks great. I don't know if it was an Aeolian, the one that's at Lake Forest College, it looks like it is an Aeolian organ. I'm not sure if this was also that or not. Anybody know the answer to that question here?
Never was an organ.
Never was here.
It's just architectural. Never an organ.
Well, that's great.
There you go.
That's even better. It certainly looks impressive. Huh. Okay. Thank you. I guess I did read that. Yes, go ahead. Yes, back there.
Talk about the beautiful stencil behind you on the back wall of the, it's very Art Nouveau,
Well, Art Nouveau, and the screen itself looks kind of Art Deco, but certainly that design is Art Nouveau. It would have been it seems to be from that period. I don't know if this was originally here. It's a great thing for pushing sound out. This must be, is it newer? Is everybody? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's newer.
But it picks up the design period, that's all. But it's good. I don't think it would have been particularly Peter Weber, but it's of the period.
Go ahead, sir.
Did I beat everybody into submission?
For those of us who aren't around here, and maybe there isn't a definite answer to this question, but what are the boundaries of the Ravinia neighborhood?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that I'm not going to answer. No, I can't see if I get this. Oh, whoop. So it seems to me that it goes clear up pretty close into Highland Park. Now, the Ravinia neighborhood was platted, as I said, in the 1870s. Highland Park was north of that. I think they sort of touched, and you can, somewhere up around, if you look at the little brochure that's been handed out, they're counting the couple of the houses as being up at the northern, up by the Frank Lloyd Wright house, the Willits house. Yes, there's an answer.
I see a flat map that takes it as far as Cedar. For Ravinia proper, a
Yeah.
flat map that I have from the original, so a plat map that I've seen from the original Baptist when they plotted it out.
Oh, yeah, sure, okay.
Goes as far as Cedar. So, I mean, that's according to that map, but I guess it depends on,
Well,
Based
no,
upon
that
it.
was the original thing, and I think that south of that, many people consider that to also be Ravinia. This area is now considered Ravinia, but it's also sort of Braeside, maybe. And I'm not sure what constitutes the Braeside neighborhood, but it was a no man's land. I mean, nobody was really there for a while. It had to do with some of the politics of the area at the time. Yeah. You let me get away with that? Okay.
I'm going to jump in right quickly. We can get a few questions about it. There is going to be a trolley shuttle that is going to pick up all of our patrons outside the main Ravinia gate. It should be here hopefully in the next 5 minutes, and it will shuttle you between here and the downtown Ravinia district up over to Full Circle Architects for the second half of today's tour. Just want to give everyone a heads up. We got a couple questions about it. Sure.
You said there was a hiatus in 1931, and was
Well,
that
yes,
just a consequence of the Depression, or what was the
Oh, yeah, no, it's totally the Depression. Similarly, there was a program, there was a graduate school program going on in Lake Forest from the mid-20s, and it ended in 1931 because nobody had any money in early 1932. People thought maybe they expected to have a program in Lake Forest in the summer of 1932. Never happened. Just no one had cash at that point. And I think that probably this fellow who was a big businessman with lots of things, but he obviously was very much invested in things, not in cash, but in his businesses. And when the income from that dropped, I'm sure that this had a somewhat negative effect on his ability to cover this. He was really a major, there may have been other donors, but he was doing a lot of it himself, just paying for it, which is an amazing concept. And then he was succeeded in 1935 by a bunch of people then coming in to revive the thing. The worst of the Depression was 1932, 33. Then that man was elected to the White House, and lots of things happened after that, like the taxes went way up, but the economy did stabilize by 1935, a little better. Yes? Yes, Theodore Roosevelt. We could never mention his name around my grandfather.
That is your hub from now on.
So that was, yeah, the Depression, totally. I mean, from 1929 to 1930, there was deflation by a power of 10. If you bought something for $100 in 1929, you could buy it for $10 in 1930. So it was an amazing difference. Just startling. We thought we had a little surprise here in 2008. Nothing compared to what 1929 to 30 was. So yes, that's why it stopped. And they were able to regroup, and a bunch of people cover it then in 1935 and going forward. Not that everything was perfect, but they were able to do that. It shows how important it was to them. By that time, the maximum income tax rate was 91%, but people who had cash were able to be generous because their cash was worth 10 times as much. So, thank you very much.